So we've started our live stream. We're going to wait a little bit for people to come on before we start. But in case you're joining us, you are at the Sorting Recyclables from Residual Waste event, co-hosted by Zero Waste Europe and Reloop. So just please be patient. We'll be starting soon. I see where people are starting to join in. We've got about 40 attendees. We're going to wait a little bit longer, everybody, before we start. This is the Sorting Recyclables from Residual Waste webinar, part of the EU Green Week partner event. We're going to wait another minute or two. Yannick, if you could just tell me when you want me to start. I'm going to wait until 2:05. So it's another minute, everybody. Thank you for your patience for those of you that are already online. So I think we're holding pretty steady at 53 people, and I'm sure some will join. So let's get started because we have a fantastic group of people on our webinar today. So hello to all. Welcome to the event that is Sorting Recyclables from Residual Waste. Our event today is co-organized by Zero Waste Europe and the Reloop platform and is an EU Green Week partner event. My name is Clarissa Morosky. I am the CEO of Reloop. For those of you that don't know, very, very briefly, Reloop is a not-for-profit international organization founded in 2015. We're a platform of like-minded individuals that have a common vision of circular economy. Our members come from member states, governments, industry, and NGOs, And our vision is a world free of pollution where an integrated circular economy allows for resources to remain resources. Today's webinar focuses on the role of sorting recyclables from residual waste or mixed waste or garbage or black garbage bin, whatever you want to say, residual waste. The event will provide an opportunity to have an open debate on the role of sorting recyclables from residual waste in EU resource policy, as well as the related benefits it brings, such as greenhouse gas emission savings, enhancing EU self-sufficiency and resilience of our own resources. In our event today, we will have the presentation of our latest report, where we commissioned Dr. Dominic Hogg to prepare a report for us called The Case for Sorting Recyclables from Residual Waste. And it will be followed by a panel discussion between our speakers. Now, some technical understanding. We have a chat box. Please feel free to introduce yourself, as some already have. Thank you very much in our chat box. When it comes to the question period, we'd like you to submit your question via the Q&A tool, which between Yannick and myself, Yannick, who's behind the scenes at Zero Waste Europe, will help, and they'll pass them to me so that we can save some time and get those questions dealt with. If you haven't noticed, we're also streaming live on YouTube. For those joining via YouTube, please submit your questions in the chat there. So let's move straight into things. We're going to hear a presentation from Dr. Dominic Hogg. It's an exciting discussion, and I'd like to give the floor to Dominic. Dominic, for those of you that don't know, Dominic was the founder of Eunomia Research and Consulting, where he led the organization for over 20 years. He has unparalleled understanding of waste policy and economics. He's received a physics degree from Oxford. He's received a master's from Wales. He's received a PhD from Cambridge. It's a pretty impressive resume. In 2020, however, Dr. Hogg stepped down from Eunomia and founded his own organization called Equinimator to spend more time thinking more deeply about some key challenges and designing policy mechanisms and strategies that drive the change needed. So with that, I'll stop talking. Dominic, if you'd like to load your presentation, please. The floor is yours.
Okay, you getting that?
Yes, sir.
You are, good. Well, many thanks, Clarissa, for the introduction, and welcome everybody. It's great to be here. This is something that I was working on with former colleagues at Eunomia at the time I was leaving, and something that I think is really topical and has relevance, I would say, globally. It's really, given the challenges of climate change and resource scarcity that are confronting us, I think these questions about how we best deal with waste, we still haven't cracked it, I don't think. And this issue about sorting recyclables from residual waste is a particularly interesting one. Why? I guess because it sort of challenges us to, certainly did us at Eunomia and now myself at Equinimator, to think about the sort of some dearly held beliefs that we'd always held dear, that maybe mixed waste sorting was terrible. In the United Kingdom, we used to have these things called dirty MRFs that we sort of long thought that were unable to deliver anything useful in terms of recycling for many years. And that was in the bad old days, I guess, of the 1990s. But the sorting technologies come on a long way. And so we're talking today about mixed waste sorting systems that are really quite sophisticated and have the potential now, with all the new technologies that have evolved over the last 20 years, to extract certain materials, and particularly plastics, in such a way that actually, if we then go through a hot washing process, we can actually get those back into quality recycling streams. And because the plastics fraction itself, of course, has become probably more important in our day-to-day life, and we're using more and more of it, then that becomes a more interesting component of the overall waste management process. But it's not just the plastics that we can get out of mixed waste. And here we're not talking about something that substitutes for separate collection, because we're going to have some issues with materials like paper and card and bio waste in terms of the extent to which they're contaminated when they're left in mixed waste. So we're talking about something here that's like having a second go at the waste to get some more value from it. And the other, we all know that however much we might like residents to behave perfectly and to sort diligently through their waste, not everyone does it. Not everyone does it perfectly. It's quite complicated. So, we don't get to 100% recycling of anything. We get close with some materials in some locations, but we very rarely get 100% of everything, even that we're targeting. And so this is the sort of thing that we're talking about, a sophisticated modern system that's capable of extracting materials from mixed waste. Now, the vast majority of what we're dealing with as waste that's left after separate collection, if you like, is sent directly to landfill or incineration. In some countries, a reasonable proportion of that material goes via a mechanical biological treatment process to landfill, with varying degrees of quality of sorting of those materials involved in that process. And we've done some analysis on this and looked at what happens to the emissions from landfill and incineration when we put in place a mixed waste sorting system in front of them. And what happens here is if we're taking out plastics in particular, then we're able to get some of those into quality recycling systems. We get a considerable saving on the overall system. So for a landfill system, you can see here, and of course it depends on the composition and various assumptions, but in our analysis here, it was about 0.29 tons of CO2 equivalent saving on the landfill side, and a bigger one on the incineration side, about 0.39. And so you can see one of the reasons for that, by the way, is that as we're going to a sort of cleaner form of energy generation, then what happens as we take the plastics out of the incineration facility is that not only are we getting some benefit from the recycling itself, but we're also reducing the extent to which the fossil CO2 is emitted by the incineration plant, and therefore contributing to climate change. And you don't get enough of that back as a credit from the energy that's being generated, because especially as the carbon intensity of the energy generation is falling, that credit itself declines. But that's probably the main reason for the distinction between the benefits from that you get from the landfill and the benefits you get at the incinerator. Now you'll notice that the two figures on the left, they see the landfill performing rather worse than the incineration facility. That's an analysis that's very sensitive to what one uses as the global warming potential for methane. And that's changing over time. All countries report their inventories using a global warming potential from the fourth assessment, IPCC assessment report. And the number they're using is still 21. It's going to go up to, I think they're now using 25. But the numbers are going up all the time. The latest IPCC Working Group 3 report has used a much higher figure, but there's a lot of discussion about whether that makes sense at all, because these gases have different residence times in the atmosphere, and some people are talking about using something called GWP star that addresses that. But the point here is that the big impact from the landfill is associated with methane. So ideally, what we would do is we'd actually do something that deals with the methane as well. Just to go back one point about the plastics, this shows at the incinerator, what's the impact for different polymers of taking 1 ton of plastic out of the incinerator and putting it into recycling. And this is shown for 3 different carbon intensities of electricity generation assuming that the incinerator is functioning as electricity only. And we know that that's not true for them all. But you can see that that benefit of switching to recycling goes up as the carbon intensity of the electricity generation falls, which is exactly what it's doing. And so what we're seeing is that this benefit from taking the plastics out of incineration into recycling is increasing over time. But back to that methane question. If I biologically stabilize the remaining fraction after we've done our mixed waste sorting on its way to a landfill, then actually I can significantly increase the overall benefit I get from my system. And you can see that you end up being, more or less indifferent in climate change terms at that point as to whether you're going mixed waste sorting and incineration or mixed waste sorting plus stabilization plus landfilling. And look at the two figures on the left-hand side, and then look at the two figures on the bottom right-hand side and ask yourself what we should be doing in a climate emergency. And you sort of think, well, is it really the case that we can justify any more sending waste either directly to a landfill or directly to an incinerator? Personally, I don't think we can. And that's part of the rationale here for this work. So if we were to do that across the European Union, well, what sort of saving would we get on an annual basis today? Well, it looks as though you'd get, even if you just did the mixed waste sorting and you did that only to the municipal waste, residual municipal waste as it's reported at the moment, you'd get about 39 million tons of CO2 equivalent saved. If you add in the stabilization on the landfill, you might get up to 75. Now, if we take all of the residual waste going into landfill and incineration reported under waste statistics regulation, those figures go up to something like 86 million tons or 151 million tons. And just to put that in some comparative context, if you like, UK total, I'm speaking from the UK total greenhouse gas emissions reported to the UN every year are about 400 million tons of CO2. So 151 is big. It's a big saving. So, and on an annual basis, that becomes very, very important indeed, because of course, carbon dioxide doesn't disappear very quickly. It's there for a long time in the atmosphere. And even when methane, by the way, supposedly loses its global warming potential over the short term, most of that methane does get converted to carbon dioxide. So the other thing, recycling targets. Everyone in the EU at least is confronting packaging and municipal waste recycling targets. And one of the most challenging ones is going to be the plastics recycling target under the packaging directive. 55% is going to be quite challenging for many countries to meet, especially under the new measurement method. So there may be opportunities for mixed waste sorting to contribute to that. And interestingly, I think there's an opportunity here perhaps for those who are operating facilities to go into discussions with extended producer responsibility organizations to see whether actually there's a deal to be done in terms of retrofitting facilities that don't currently have that type of sorting in place. And of course, it also contributes to the municipal waste targets, the 65% targets in future. There's an interesting effect of these processes on both incinerators and landfills. If we start with a ton of municipal waste that's got a calorific value of say 9.5 to 11.5 gigajoules per ton, which is not untypical in Europe. Suppose we then subject that to a sorting process, then not only have we got less material going into the incinerator, but we've also reduced its overall calorific value. And so you end up with around 30% perhaps drop in the calorific content of that material. And that's quite an interesting effect, because at the moment, you've got something like 60 million tons of municipal waste being incinerated across Europe. In theory, you've upped the potential for that fleet of incineration to deal with municipal waste to set around 75 million tons. but the overall system might be able to deal with something close to 90, maybe a little less. And that raises some interesting questions about, well, how much more of this do we need? If we look forward to a 65% recycling target on the basis of the existing reporting of municipal waste, it's only about 70 odd million tons of residual waste that will be there to be dealt with in 2030, 2035. And similar things are going on with the landfill here. If you take out that material and then you account for the loss of moisture and carbon from the remaining biomass, you've only got about half a ton from what you started with to be landfilled. Different placement density also. So there's a 10% landfill target. We're not so sure whether that really makes sense at the moment. But that 10% target effectively becomes a 20% limit on the input to the system for any one country in the current context. Now, there's an interesting effect potentially on employment. Of course, this type of analysis is far from perfect. We've used some figures, the best figures, if you like, are from a range of studies to try and estimate what sort of additional jobs you might get from the recycling net of what might otherwise have happened to it as residual waste. And it looks as though there might be something of the order 23,000 jobs, 24,000 jobs across the whole of the EU. And that's before you add in what economists call multipliers, which are the effects of those people with jobs spending money and effectively creating more employment in the rest of the economy. And those multiplier effects are sort of somewhere between 2 or 3, depending on whether you're looking at all of the effects of that spending. Those difficult always to make those assumptions very clear, depending on the level of employment in the economy. So how do we make this happen? I think there are basically 2 strands here. One is with the incineration side. Can we actually give an incentive for those operating, owning incinerators to start to move in this direction and to contribute more to climate change mitigation? And one incentive, which is now actively discussed in the Parliament, is to include incineration in the emissions trading scheme. And also there's a consultation ongoing in the United Kingdom, where I am, to do the same in what is now a separate UK emissions trading scheme. And within that, there's an interesting issue around, well, how should you deal with the non-fossil material that's combusted? And I think there's potentially an interesting discussion about how biomass is defined and whether or not biomass should be effectively zero rated under the emissions trading scheme, given that at the moment, most of the biomass that's going in with incineration plants is accompanied by quite a large amount of fossil-derived carbon as well. So is there something to be said for trying to define biomass differently or amend those rules so that the zero rating, if you like, of biomass that's currently applied could be adjusted to take into account what's going on there? And it could be as well that an argument for a mandate on putting mixed waste sorting facilities in place of incinerators might make sense. Maybe not for those sites that are coming right to the end of their life, because, arguably, as we were saying earlier, there may even be an argument for retiring some of those and looking at just phasing out capacity. And, one doesn't want to impose people to put in place capital equipment that's a bit of a white elephant. So, there's maybe an argument though with new facilities, and ones that are newer, to look at the mandating that type of retrofitting. And then similarly for the landfill. And I was reflecting on the fact that actually this was essentially what might have happened in a bio-waste directive that we were talking about 20 years ago, and effectively looking at, could we not properly define stabilization and properly regulate landfilling so that we had mixed waste sorting and stabilization required prior to landfilling, and possibly support that if the Commission was so emboldened with a sort of minimum tax rate, much as we have under the Energy Tax Directive, with minimum tax levels for different hydrocarbon fuels and so forth. So that's the summary of the case, if you like, that we think exists. And as you can see, we think that there's an argument to get ourselves away from thinking of either landfilling or incinerating direct, and actually to shift away from those as being acceptable solutions, because in a climate constrained world, it doesn't feel as though they are anymore, and that we really should be looking to up our game. And actually, to be perfectly frank, we should be looking for the same sorts of things to be happening in other countries across the world, possibly supported by various sort of climate finance mechanisms. That's me done. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Okay, so what a useful and interesting report it is. I've actually had the privilege of, and I'm going to ask you to put you on mute, please, Dominic. I've had the privilege of reading it. For those of you, we have not put it on our website yet, but we will very, very soon. And if you want to get a notification that it's available, please go to LinkedIn and follow Reloop platform on LinkedIn and or on Twitter. And as soon as it's out over the next few days, we'll be sure that you can get a copy of it. For now, I am going to turn to our panel, and I'm sure the audience is eager to discuss these findings, what can be done to bring the EU landfill target in line with a true circular economy, but also energy from waste facilities and our ETS. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a quick reaction from our panelists, sort of 5 to 7 minutes from Luca Menezzini, and then we're going to move to our other panelists. So before I go to Luca, I'm going to introduce him. So first of all, Luca Menezzini is the president of the province of Lucca and mayor of Capanori, the first municipality in Europe to sign up to a zero waste strategy in 2007. Since January 2020, he is a member of the European Committee of Regions, where he takes part in the ENVA, the Committee for Environment, Climate Change and Energy. Given his sound interest towards environmental issues and sustainable local development, Menezzini works to bring the Green Deal at a local level. As a mayor committed to a carbon neutral Europe, he signed the Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and he's recently joined the Climate Pact Ambassadors Network. Thank you for joining us today, Luca, and please take it away for 5 to 7 minutes. Your reaction to Dominic's presentation, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me today. As mayor of Capanori, I've worked to improve the zero waste strategy adopted by the municipality. Capanori has committed to zero waste since 2007 with the goal of limiting the share of waste landfilled by 2020. Introducing a successful door-to-door waste collection pilot scheme that has been achieved with the engagement of all the community. That is why I'd like to stress that the role of citizens in waste management and prevention is key to achieve these goals. We have achieved a recycling rate of 80% and we want to grow more. Since then, the strategy of Capanori has become more and more ambitious, moving towards a circular economy local strategy built upon resources recovery, recycling, and reuse practice. The major challenge has ever come from mixed waste sorting. When it comes to sort residual waste, we can easily separate plastics and bring it back to the circular loop with recycling process. Whereas products such textiles, diapers, tampons usually are not recovered. In Capanori, we are working to recover textiles with the launch of a municipal reuse network and diapers. For this last type of waste, we have invested in a major circular economy project funded under the National Recovery Plan, that is the creation of an industrial plant for recovering plastics and cellulose from diapers and pads. Extracting resources from waste as much as possible. Sorting material from residual waste to recycle, recover resources. This is the position of the Committee of the Region. As member of the Commission for Environmental and Energy, I have worked to promote and make sure that circular economic principles are embedded in the Zero Pollution Action Plan, starting from waste prevention. The weakness of the existing EU residual waste policy is that in the landfill directive, there is no mention to waste prevention. That is important that when the directive will be reviewed, the prevention principle shall be included at the whole directive as to be aligned with the objectives of the Circular Economy Action Plan and the Zero Pollution Strategy. In a EU waste framework, existing directive and the proposal for new amendments, there is too much focus on the amount of residual waste and ends up in landfill rather than considering sustainable alternative for waste treatment. Indeed, the share of 10% of municipal waste landfilled is a good target we must continue to look at. We also welcome the European Parliament proposal to set a residual waste cap, including in the last February resolution on the new Circular Economic Action Plan. However, this approach might tend to favor to foster the incineration of residual waste that we all know it might trigger a lock-in effect. Incineration must not be the solution for residual waste. Today, we are here to prove why and how we can efficiently deal with mixed waste sorting in order to recover resources and keep them in the circular economic loop for use. At a local level, many different strategies have been developed and set up. Biological treatment has proved to be an efficient way to manage residual waste in compliance with the landfill directive. And it is even more sustainable recovering dry recyclable without producing refuse-derived fuel so as to avoid release of carbon dioxide. Through a combination of biological stabilization and sorting technologies, we avoid methane emission from landfills, CO2 from combustion, and we recover dry recyclables. With this operational layout, the waste treatment plant has more flexibility since it can be converted to process clean, organic, and dry recyclable from a separate collection, thereby supporting the increase of separate collection rather than being compelled to manage only residual waste. More flexibility should be given to local authorities for residual waste management. Local and regional authorities play a very important role in the transition to circular economy, as they are responsible for policies and in charge of services relating waste and resource management. Then we should insist in waste prevention, as the issue at stake here is that we continue producing too much waste. We should promote a reuse culture and work more on products and resources recovery. We can't succeed ecological transition if we continue considering as option outdated waste treatment processes that leave us stuck to the 90s and are way far from embracing the circular economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca. Appreciate your comments. So we've heard from government, and now we're going to hear a perspective from industry. And we bring to you today Rebecca Colley-Jones. Rebecca is a circular economy project manager at the Polyolefin Circular Economy Platform, also known as PCEP. Rebecca has over 20 years experience of working in resource efficiency and circular economy. As the circular economy project manager of CPEP, Rebecca is committed to delivering the system transformation of polyolefin industry from a linear to a circular economy. PCEP is a unique organization bringing together actors from every stage of the polyolefin value chain to collaborate, identify barriers, and deliver solutions for a circular polyolefin economy. Rebecca, can you please take 5 minutes to give us your comments on Dominic's report? Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, some very interesting information out of the report that Dominic has done, and this very much aligns with the work that PCEP are hoping to achieve in the next few years. So as you mentioned, Clarissa, PCEP brings together all stakeholders in the polyolefin value chain and is trying to show and demonstrate the collective commitment of the industry in creating one voice for polyolefins in Europe. And the idea that we have is to transform the polyolefin system from a linear to a circular one. And one of these ways of doing this is to be able to collect and use as much polyolefin as possible in order and put it back into products in order to achieve this circularity. And as Dominic highlighted, current recycling systems are not as effective as they could be because there are losses all the way through the chain. So I think we need to start at the beginning and look at the design and see how we design for making sure that we can recover the material so that when we do capture it, that it can then be used back into products. And I think that's a key thing. But I very much welcome the idea of collecting the mixed waste prior to incineration and landfill. One of the things that was highlighted, we recently did a Conversio study which highlighted the amount of waste going from of polyolefin that's going to both landfill and energy from waste. And this is before process losses. There was 3.9 million tons going to landfill and 7.9 million tons going to energy recovery. That's a huge amount of the polyolefins that are produced and offers an amazing opportunity to be able to capture that material and put it back to work. I do agree with Luca that we need to be looking at reuse as well, and that's one of the projects that we're taking forward in PCEP, and waste prevention is equally important. However, we have to recognize that there is still a lot of energy from waste and landfill out there, and making it more efficient by removing these materials prior to it going in is a great way of being able to capture more of that valuable material. Also, as PCEP, we've been involved with CFlex in having a look at the composition analysis in different countries with different schemes for collection in terms of what's in the residual and what's in the recycling streams. And currently, the UK and German reports are complete. And we can see there's a big difference in terms of having those separate collections in the first place, which is something that Dominic mentioned as well, which is that those systems need to be in place in order to be able to capture it. Because the dirtier it gets and the more it goes through the process of being shifted around as part of a dirty mix of materials, the more expensive it will be in order to process it even if you capture the material, there's going to be considerable cost there in order to clean it up sufficiently to be able to use it back into materials. And of course, going back to my first comment, it has to be designed so that you can clean and process it and get it back into materials. So that is a fundamental point that needs to be added to this. It has to be fit for purpose from the beginning, from the design stage. So I welcome this opportunity and this report, the opportunity to speak and the report, because I think that it is another tool. It's not the only tool we need to be looking at. Obviously, there are a wide variety, and they've been mentioned today, of things that need to go in place. And as PSEP, we've increased our pledge for 2025 to 4 million tonnes of products being used in European of recyclates being used in European products again. Which is an increase of 2 million tonnes on the baseline from 2016, and we would love to achieve more. That is a key message, and really, in order to do that, we need to have the infrastructure in place, and I think that this is part of the solution. And so I shall leave it there, Clarissa, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And before I go to Enzo, just to say that it's becoming quite clear that sorting mixed waste is really a dual action in terms of dealing with the climate, creating tremendous benefits in terms of reduced GHGs, so our whole climate agenda, but at the same time, our waste agenda. So it's actually sort of killing two birds with one stone as a policy initiative. So it's very, very interesting, especially for the EU policymakers. So finally, I'd like to introduce you all to Enzo Favioni. How was that, Enzo? You're going to have to help me. I've always had trouble with his name. Enzo is the chair of the scientific committee at Zero Waste Europe, and he also works with the Scuola Agraria del Parco di Monza, a research and technical development center with a prominent role in promoting separate collection and sustainable management of discards around Europe. He often provides local support to local authorities, national governments and agencies, and international organizations, including the EU, in defining strategies and policies. Now, Enzo, you authored Zero Waste Europe's strategy for residuals, material recovery and biological treatment, MRBT, to manage residual waste within a circular economy. What role do you think mixed waste sorting plays in the concept of MRBT, please?
Thanks for the invitation to speak as a panelist, and thanks for the nice introduction. You did quite well with my family name. It's not easy even for the Italians, so don't worry about that. We make it difficult on purpose in order not to be mimicked by anybody. However, let me start in an unusual way. When I started working on separate collection, recycling, composting, that was some 30 years ago, Italy was at 3% separate collection. Now it has got a national average of 65%. Slovenia, when Slovenia joined the European Union, they were around 4%, something like that, as all the other Central Eastern European countries. And now they are worldwide leaders in separate collection, targeting 70%, which is right around the corner for them. But also we had in the panel the mayor from Capannori, and it was nice to have him because Capannori was the first municipality ever in Europe to adopt a zero waste commitment back in 2007. Capannori is now just a tiny bit from 90% separate collection. So this means, okay, there is no limit to ambition. And this translates not only the letter, but also the spirit of the circular economy agenda. We have to set the bar of the ambition higher and higher. And we have to keep materials in the loop in their highest and best status as long as possible. Let me also specify, we do have this material recovery target, preparation for use and recycling at 2035, 65%. But this is the minimum target, not the maximum one. Some calculations, you know, that wrongly assume the latter. They consider that as being the maximum target, whereas we have to go well beyond it. That's the minimum target. Also, Dominic brought up in a nice way the imperfections in separate collection, much as we work daily in order to improve behavior by the households. Well, we never get to 100% perfection because 100% is not in this world, but we get closer and closer. But there's another domain of materials which is intriguingly important and worthwhile for what we are discussing today, which are those materials which are not targeted by curbside collection or EPR schemes. For instance, non-packaging plastics. And they tend to concentrate in residual waste. You know, we have got 130 municipalities down here in Italy, already above 90% separate collection. So if the dirty Italians can play with dirt, everybody can do that, of course. But consider the separate collection percentage. It means that residual waste is less than 10% of the starting amount and volume of municipal solid waste. This means that all the materials which were not targeted by curbside collection because they were not covered by EPR, they tend to concentrate in residual waste. So this is why we have got an increasing percentage of valuable plastic polymers there that may be easily recovered. Why easily? Also because we implement separate collection of the organics. Also, we may need new schemes and technologies to recover at a later stage in the near future those materials which are not technically recyclable today. Luca Menesini from Capanori just mentioned the NEPIS recycling program, which is gaining momentum over here. There's already a pilot project in Contarina, one of the zero waste champion districts, and this is why they get so much focused in trying to recover as much as possible also from residual waste and not only from separate collection. However, what do we need in the system is flexibility, because starting from 3% and getting up to 65, 70, 80, 85% requires a lot of flexibility in the system. So residual waste management policy and practice have to align with this needed flexibility. This is why at Zero Waste Europe, we have so long been focused on the need also to provide a consistent vision and strategy for the management of residuals. We are zero wasters, but we are so much in love with residual waste. First of all, because in residual waste, we have got a beautiful inventory of what are the current mistakes in the system. So we can continuously redesign the separate collection systems in order to improve the behavior by households, but also we can redesign those materials which are not reusable or recyclable today to make them reusable and recyclable and compostable tomorrow. So we issued this paper on what we call the bridge strategy. What shall we do with residual waste while we pave our way towards maximized recycling? And what Dominic depicted in his presentation basically aligns with the vision, because it provides, rock solid arguments to combine biological stabilization with recovery of materials also from residual waste. There's already quite a few sites out there across Europe which have shown the possibility to be converted to process less and less residual waste and more clean materials coming from curbside collection. And they keep the financial equilibrium in the system because the tonnage will be pretty much the same. They will have less residuals and more clean materials coming from curbside schemes, including the clean organics. There's already quite a few sites which have been fully converted from biological stabilization of the dirty organics, still included in residual waste, which minimizes methane, as Dominic beautifully explained, into clean composting sites. So let me leave aside the climate argument just because it's the most important one. We are now aligning all the different environmental policies which were comparatively blind on each other so far, but now we are aligning the waste management policy also with the climate policy. However, let me just say that what comes up from today's presentations is the operational viability of recovering materials also from residual waste. And as I said, there are already sites out there which are operating along these lines, and they recover 30 to 35% materials. They have got a further 10 to 15% mass loss thanks to biological stabilization. They minimize the climate footprint of landfills afterwards. So this can be done. This can be done. Let me put some icing on the cake. What are the preconditions in order to have it done, and have it done in an operationally optimized way and in a economically effective way? We need separation of the organics because we need to get residual waste less dirty and less sticky as possible. But this is happening. This is already happening across Europe. We have got a mandate stipulated by Article 22 in the Waste Framework Directive with the obligation to separate organics. And we know that there are schemes for organics which are diverting 85 to 90% of the organics through separate collection, even in large cities, as the city of Milan is showing evidence. 1.4 million people, 800,000 daily commuter workers, and they are capturing 87.5% of the organics. So with a system like that, the percentage of the organics in residual waste will be much lower. Also, what we need, improvement in sorting technologies, but this is also happening. And we know from the practical experience, from what happens in the real operational life, that such systems are working. Such systems are working. So both conditions are happening across Europe. Just to top it up with a final statement, I particularly like the point which has been made that these systems have to supplement separate collection. They do not have to replace separate collection, on account of quite a few arguments, which I'm pretty sure you know, but I'm ready to discuss them in details if need be during the follow-up discussion. It actually may be a tool in order to, make it possible the maximization of separate collection levels in time, because it keeps the needed flexibility in the system. So we will have more separately collected materials, both dry recyclables and clean organics, less and less residual waste. And so we may convert the capacities of the starting site, which was originally designed only to process residual waste, into more capacities for clean materials coming from separate collection. I'm done. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Enzo. We are going to now take this webinar in our last, just shy of 40 minutes left. We're going to go to you, the audience. We've already got some questions teed up. If you have a question, go to the Q&A, ask your question. And I'm going to start right now then with the first one, which really talks about, Madeline Burbage is asking about a little bit, some details about the efficiency of these operations, these pre-sorting facilities. And I think this is a question for Dominic. Trying to get up, if you could just walk us through very briefly how these systems work. You know, what's the cost benefit? Do you need to use hot water to clean everything? And has there been rigorous data collected? She's referring to a site in the Netherlands where she heard about 13 to 14% was being extracted. Could you give us a little bit more of some of the meat around the details of what is the potential and what that cost benefit looks like, without numbers, just sort of showing us both sides of that, please? You have to unmute. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll try. The sorting systems are getting, I would say, especially good now on plastics. And for Madeline's information, my former colleagues at Eunomia have done quite a lot of work poring over some of these facilities to gain proper mass balances. And I mean, really good quality ones where we understand exactly where the material is going and so forth. And so one of the things I think it's fair to say that was found in that work was that the different sorting facilities are actually targeting slightly different forms of plastic, for example. And they're doing that partly based on the market that may be available for extracting the materials they're taking out. That may be part of the decision-making process. that figure of 13 to 14% that you've got in your question, I see. I mean, is that, I'm not sure that's based on 13 to 14% of the input or whatever. I think that's roughly right. So you can see again why this is potentially only ever a complement to a recycling system where you've got to get to 65%. But what's important is that you can get out some of those materials like plastic, where at the moment we're still seeing quite a significant climate benefit from taking that material out. So that's consistent with what we were saying. With some of those plastics, there's two things. One is that at the moment, there's a lot of focus on the washing and making sure that those materials can go into closed loop systems where possible, and that can happen. In terms of the costs and benefits, we have, whilst I was still at Eunomia, we did some work on that and looked at some of those costs and benefits and how they pan out. It depends actually on, to some extent, it depends on the contractual situation for the operator of the site, and if they're whether it's landfill or incineration side, and particularly for an incinerator, there may be an issue about, well, okay, can I substitute the material that I've effectively had removed from my particular facility with material from somewhere else? And that may be a locally relevant question. But it's a complicated cost-benefit analysis, and I can't summarize it very, very easily here. But the 13 to 14% seems about right, and that you're talking about. I had in my figure, I think, 100 to 150 kilos for every ton coming in. And that's, of course, it depends on the composition, what people are targeting, and so forth. So this isn't going to get you sort of 50% of what's coming into your mixed waste sorting facility out, unless you've got an incredibly strange waste composition in the first place. You know, we're not talking about a massive amount of material being extracted by those systems. But the point is that in terms of the carbon benefit, it doesn't actually have to be, because those are materials for which the carbon benefit is significant. Incidentally, there will come a time when we're not worried so much about carbon, but we'll start to worry about energy. When those come, and then we'll start to understand that actually the energy saving is equally relevant, because it means we don't have to develop so much of the infrastructure that's required to generate the energy. And that has its own costs, as we know, in terms of the materials that are used to generate that energy in the first place. So yes, there's but that, and by the way, the analysis on the climate change did include all of the energy used in the sorting, in the washing process, within that analysis. So that's already in there.
Thank you, Dominic. I'm going to ask Rebecca a question. Rebecca, I'm sure you were on the webinar earlier today. Dominic, if you could please mute. Yeah. We had the European Commission present some of their thinking around the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive. And two things that became quite clear is that they are very seriously considering a per capita waste prevention target and recycled content targets on both food grade and non-food grade packaging. Much of that is polyolefin. I wonder if you can tell me if, after hearing the ambition that looks like to be coming out of the Commission in the form of a regulation, no doubt, how does that tie in when you hear Dominic's report and the possibilities of mixed waste sorting? Do you see that natural connection of this type of policy supporting those targets specific to packaging? Now I'm talking.
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, every bite of the cherry, I think Dominic said it's like a second bite at getting some of the material, and it kind of obviously within the EU, collection systems do vary, and for some countries there's quite a way to go in order to be able to get quality material or even separate material. And I think it's really important that any way of being able to capture the material is important, because you can't recycle it and make it available unless you're collecting it or capturing it in some way. And I think that it's not the best way to catch it, because the cleanup costs are great. I think that as you mentioned, the prevention elements of it, and I think people are going to have to bite the bullet and see that the prevention measures like reuse, refill, refurbishment, they're coming, and they need to be, and the way that people do business is going to have to change somewhat. But it's important that whichever, even if you have that waste prevention, you're always going to have the waste emerging, and polyolefins, as you quite rightly say, are a large part of the packaging, but also a large part of non-packaging as well. And let's not forget, you know, like as a polyolefin value chain, we actually are looking at all types of polyolefins, so electronics, construction, automotive, and let's not forget those. And I think that this is a great way of being able to capture some of those materials that perhaps don't have. I think Enzo mentioned in terms of those streams that are perhaps not as well collected, and obviously with flexible packaging becoming, you know, kind of a dominant feature in collecting it, capturing it, and recycling it, all of these mechanisms are important.
Thank you, Rebecca. Now, a quick question to you, Enzo, from Damien. He asks you about stabilization to reduce GHG emissions from a landfill. He asks, what about upgrading the landfill cover? There is not one type of landfill. Differences should be made between landfill with very high biogas capture, over 90%, and others, don't you think?
Partly, only partly. I concur that the final cover may be different regarding whether a very thorough stabilization has been performed or not. This is what is happening, for instance, in Austria. They have got a different technical regulation, only including a biologically active layer, final layer, in order to you know, minimize release of fugitive methane. But since the production of methane is only residual by then, because there are very compelling requirements for biological stabilization. So the release of methane is so slow that the final biologically active layer may turn it into carbon dioxide, which is biogenic and therefore carbon neutral, according to current methodologies. 90% capture of gas, I've never met one such situation, so I'm much less confident in this respect. But anyway, you know, in Europe, we have got, since 1999, we have got a landfill directive that mandates pre-treatment. This is part of our vision at Zero Waste Europe. We ask for a thorough revision and reshuffling of the residual waste management policy with a more thorough consolidation of the obligation on pre-treatment, because that's where the impacts of landfills are concentrated for those countries which have not fully implemented the obligation on pretreatment. If we have it biologically stabilized as an alternative to incineration, we have got the job done, and we can keep the system flexible, as we were discussing during this webinar.
Thank you, Enzo. I have a question for Luca now. This is about the diaper recycling that you were talking about. You mentioned investment in technology processes for recovering plastics from diapers. Which types of final recycling technologies were you referring to?
So there is a plant in North Italy, Contarina. They experimented it during some years, and so we are going to make a similar plant. So, but maybe for technological matter, maybe Enzo can explain better than me. Enzo?
Yes, if I may quickly jump in also to support you, Luca, because Luca's task as a mayor is already very, very demanding, and therefore he cannot delve deeper into the technical details of the strategies he's promoting. Now, basically, this nappies recycling site is, they're basically autoclaving the nappies, and then they're separating the cellulose fiber, cotton from plastics, and from the superabsorbent, which is one of the components of nappies. They can recycle both the cellulose fiber in the paper industry and the plastics. The plastics, you know, it's a monotype plastics, and so it's easy to be recycled, that one. What's the current limitation is the recycling of the polymer, the superabsorbent, sodium acrylate. Actually, I myself, in the research center I work at, we contributed to their research, background research in the beginning. We found out a possible application for that in hydroponic culture. The problem is that the market is not there ready yet to ripe all the superabsorbent, which would then be produced. But, you know, this in itself is an outstanding example that residual waste is not just to be left behind and to be forgotten about. It is something that we may investigate in order to define new ways to recover more materials. And so from a bigger problem, we shrink it to a smaller one, and then maybe to a smallest one. That's the true spirit of circular economy.
Thank you, Enzo. A question about quality from Katie Lindsay, talking about the improvements that have been made on mixed waste sorting technology, but how actually do the plastics extracted from a mixed waste sorting facility compare in terms of quality with separately collected plastics? Dominic or Enzo, maybe one of you could speak up. Enzo, Dominic? Dominic, you're on mute.
Sorry, on the quality.
Yes.
Interestingly, for some of these, when they're properly hot washed, certainly the experience we had is a pretty good and pretty close to what you might get from source segregated materials, particularly for the plastics. And you probably understand why in terms of the ease with which those materials can be cleaned. So I think, or relative ease relative to other materials. So the quality there is pretty good. And I don't, I think the issue will become more one of, well, how are the markets evolving, and what therefore do the facilities decide they need to extract, given what, as Enzo was saying previously, is being targeted by the separate collection system. So I think that's probably going to be the issue going forward. We already have a huge problem recycling some really nicely separated plastics that we have no really good market for, so they end up going to things like cement kilns and so forth. So we shouldn't ignore the sort of system issue here, which is one that we've got to get both the design of the materials we're consuming and the products we're consuming better than they are. And secondly, we've got to have the end processes to deal with this material. Of course, there's lots of discussion about the promise of chemical recycling. We'll have very different views about that I'm sure, amongst the people on this panel. But, if that works, then this might be an interesting source of material for those people. But, there's a bit of an if there still in terms of how well that will work, at what scale, what will really get recycled as opposed to going into forms of fuel, energy, and so forth. So we'll see.
Enzo, did you want to have a crack at it? And if you do, I'll just throw another one in. There's a question about quality, but also sorting of soft plastics or flexible plastics, and how just your thoughts on the ability to use this to sort all of the flexibles or many of the flexibles out of the waste stream as well. How feasible is it actually connected to quality?
You want a feedback, Dominic, or shall I go? I go. No, this is what is happening actually at those sites which are already performing mixed waste sorting. They basically separate all the types of polymers, but you have to consider those are similar technologies to those of a MRF. Of course, if I may top up what Dominic just replied regarding the quality, yes, we can basically achieve the very same quality. Of course, this tends to be more resource intensive than separate collection. And since at Zero Waste Europe, not only do we want to maximize recycling, but also to make it least resource intensive, this is a further reason why we prioritize separate collection. Not the only one, but a further reason why. this has to supplement separate collection and not fully replace it. But when it comes to residual waste management, still the topmost option, to my opinion and to our opinion at Zero Waste Europe. Yeah, but when it comes to flexible packaging, yes, indeed. I know a site which is actually recovering, as I think I quickly mentioned it during my contribution to the panel. They're actually recovering between 30 and 35%, depending, as Dominic nicely put, on the composition of residual waste, which may be different from season to season, depending on new implementations, the growth of the pay-as-you-throw systems, and so on and so forth. But they're recovering between 30 and 35%, and the biggest chunk of that is plastics, both rigid and flexible plastics. And there's also a contribution by metals, both ferrous and non-ferrous metals, and also by paper and cardboard, because in that specific area, they have got less than 10% organics inside residual waste, which makes all the materials in residual waste perfectly recyclable. And with optical sorters and ballistic separators and magnetic separators, and then decurrent separators, you can have everything sorted.
Dominic?
Could I just add one thing as well, going back to that point about markets, and I know, Clarissa, this is something you're working very, very much on. I think it's worth noting as well that some of the areas that are more focused on, or have been so far more focused on mixed waste sorting, by no means all, are places that have got really good deposit refund systems in place. Because what that's doing is it's taking out the really easy, well, the PET bottles, for which there is a really well-functioning recycling market, and taking them out at a very, very high extraction rate, so that what you're left with actually is a more difficult, by no means all of them, of course, more easily and less easily recycled plastics, but you've taken out that part that is the really most easily recycled element. And once you've taken all of the PET bottles out, then you start to go quite quickly into stuff that's really quite difficult to find functional markets for. So we've got to work on those end markets, as well as in terms of the separation technology and the upfront sorting, to actually improve the packaging recycling rates, that particularly for plastics, that we've got to try and achieve.
And just as a quickie, you mentioned plastics, but of course, isn't there a benefit to, for example, getting the aluminum cans that were put in the residual bin out of the waste, so that they don't end up at the bottom of an incinerator being recycled into low-end markets? So it's not just a benefit for plastics per se, mixed waste sorting, it's very much a broader benefit for other materials, yes?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, as Enzo was saying, and we some of the systems are targeting some of the glass as well, and so the ability to reach those end markets is a very positive thing. And you mentioned the metals from incineration. In our analysis, again, we've taken into account the fact that you will get some extraction of, and indeed quite a lot of extraction of aluminium and of steel from incineration plants. Again, it's not going to be 100%, and it varies a lot across the different facilities. We've credited that in that analysis on the climate change, and we've not really, we've not penalized or differentiated between the ones taken out of the mixed waste sorting from the ones taken out of the incineration. But probably the price would be what differentiates there, because you will see a difference in the quality, particularly of the steel, probably the aluminium as well. And it's much less likely with aluminium to get into closed loop going into beverage containers, where you retain the function of the actual alloy as opposed to, should we say, the base material. So, that there is a benefit there as well.
And what about RDF, Dominic, from residual waste? How does RDF, if at all, fit into this strategy? Well, and then we'll go to Enzo after you.
Well, there's an argument that says that what's coming, if you're putting a mixed waste sorting plant in front of an incinerator, then arguably what you're ending up with is a refuse-derived fuel of sorts. Of course, there are different standards that people set, and whether or not the main sort of standard in Europe, though, is I would say, relatively okay to meet for people to qualify for SRF standards in Europe. But I think how do we more clearly define and have better quality here? Certainly, I think we've had an interesting evolution over time with RDF and SRF. The focus used to be very much on getting high calorific value material out of a mixed waste system and into a thermal facility. Now, the problem with that is the high calorific value material tends to be the plastic. And so what you're doing is you're trying to get as much sort of fossil derived material into things that burn it. And the worst thing you can do now with plastic, which is a fossil derived carbon material, is burn it. And so, we've got to be careful here. We've got to be careful and understand what's happening to the flows of carbon going through our systems. If we're serious about tackling climate change, we can't sit on our hands and pretend that these things are a bit too difficult when we know today that we can do them. So let's do them.
Did you want to add something, Enzo, or should I move on to the next question?
Well, I had actually picked this one question. I can see plenty of worthwhile questions, but they would take yet another webinar to be addressed. And I'm particularly happy with that. But this one is particularly worthwhile because, of course, so once in RDF, what ends up in RDF is basically plastics and paper. And so once we recover those materials, there's not so much left for RDF. So the question should rather be, why should we opt for either one? Well, my vision, I'm here to contribute with the vision of the Zero Waste Europe, but Zero Waste Europe is one of the reference networks when it comes to the true implementation of the circular economy vision, making the vision of circular economy into operational reality. So first of all, we want to maximize the total recovery rates. We want to keep the resources in the loop in their highest status for as long as possible. And secondly, we wanted to align the waste management policy and in specific residual waste management policy with the climate policy. So instead of burning, we would like to recover. So that's it. But also this lets me also reconsider what Dominic said during his presentation. Much as we are not so much supportive to thermal treatment, incineration and the like, we are pragmatic. We know they cannot be shut down overnight and on the fly. But Dominic made a very good point. With mixed waste sorting, the current capacity is already more than sufficient across Europe. So the issue would be not, shall we build new ones, but let's optimize the management of the existing ones and let's start considering some decommissioning plans in the near future, as soon as they come to the end of their business plans, the current business plans, instead of going for a second round, they may be shut down. That's it.
Thank you, Enzo. We have a question here for Rebecca, and this is on packaging design, and maybe you can comment on this. What can we do to eliminate waste left inside the containers when disposed? Current dispensing methods leave product inside. Squeeze tubes, pumps are the culprit. Wasteful innovations run rampant, and most containers with dispensers and dispensing methods are landfilled readily. I wonder if you can comment on that, maybe talk a little bit about some of the innovations taking place in order for these packages to be easier to recycle because they have less product in them.
Yeah, there's certainly been a lot of innovations in this area recently in terms of making them more mono-material for the squeeze tubes, for example, so that at least they can, there's only a tiny bit of residual left, so at least they can enter a recycling stream and not be complicated by the fact that they're mixed material. This is also an area where reuse is coming into its own a little bit, and the pumps themselves, as there's been a lot of innovation in terms of making those again a similar material and working with them to the main body of the unit, and then making that recyclable at end of life. So there has been considerable innovation. It has been something that manufacturers have been concentrating on in terms of trying to minimize the impacts of having those issues.
Thank you. And also a question about why are so many mechanical solutions for mixed polymers overlooked, not the perfect utopian recycling, but here we're talking really about taking materials and putting them into pipes and those kinds of, and fences and those kinds of downcycled, this is a direct replacement of virgin inputs. Why is this not happening more?
I think it is happening. It's a question of and it's quite interesting at the moment because you've got the food contact material regulation amendments, which will look more towards achieving that utopia that was mentioned of packaging to packaging, with the hope, especially within polyolefins, that you've got some roots via novel technologies to be able to make that a possibility, whereas that possibility was not very large previously. But there's a huge amount of material goes into construction products or into and growing in terms of going into things like electronics and into automotive as well. There are a lot of, it's not necessarily downcycling either. I mean, if it's retaining its value, then it's retaining its value. And it's been mentioned a number of times about the polymer retaining its value, and there is a hierarchy for recyclers in terms of that value being retained. So I think that one of the issues, and touched upon it previously, is organic contamination of things like packaging, and being able to remove that organic contamination. The report that Dominic alluded to in this, the TOMRA report, which looks at separating out the organic material in the first place, that will help towards that, because there's a lot of cost and energy costs in terms of cleaning up that organic material, because then the systems, the infrastructure that's in place currently has been designed almost for pre-consumer, which is a much cleaner material than post-consumer. And once you start dealing with post-consumer, I was seen in the UK, you've got flexibles now being collected front of store, and the issue with those flexibles is the amount of organic material that's contaminating them. And there needs to be fiscal support and financial support to make sure that infrastructure, which is like the joining the dots bit in the middle, is in place to be able to produce a polymer of a quality so that it can be used in other applications. Maybe EPR mechanism is the way forward to be able to achieve that. Not just at the moment, it seems to be very concentrated on the collection sorting side, but actually equally important is the processing side of it, and the additional costs there.
Thank you, Rebecca. In the last few minutes that we have about 6-7 minutes left. I would like you all, knowing what is on the table from a policy perspective at the EU right now. We have an emissions trading system that is just about to be decided on over the next few months. We have a renewable energy directive that has some potential provisions for sorting before incineration. And of course, we have the waste framework directive, where the consultation officially began a week or so ago. And that also opens a very nice opportunity for some amendments to see that many facilities, or most that still have life in them, will have a requirement for pretreatment. I wonder if you could take a minute or two each to tell us, what do you think are the most important decisions that have to be made from EU policy leaders? And when I say policy leaders, I mean, let's just assume that they are global leaders in terms of thought leaders. What do they need to do? Let's start with you, Enzo.
I think the roadmap is quite clear by now. Some of the latest votes at the European Parliament and the Committee of Regions were particularly clarifying in this respect. You yourself, Clarissa, mentioned the emission trading scheme, which came some 10 days ago, the vote at the ENVI committee at the European Parliament. The very same day, they voted also on the Renewable Energy Directive, calling for a mandate on mixed waste sorting, by the way, which is what we are discussing today. But also, let me recall two important votes that took place at the European Parliament back in February 2021, I think I remember. That was the one on the Circular Economy Action Programme. And then in October 2021, the one on the methane strategy. And both, basically, let me translate them in a nutshell. In a circular economy oriented Europe, the problem is not landfill in itself, but it is residual waste. Because residual waste, whether it goes to a landfill or to an incinerator, it's a leakage of resources and materials from the circular management. So we have to reshuffle the residual waste policy. And in this respect, I particularly support what was one of the calls by the European Parliament on the European Commission to consider in the ongoing revision of the circular economy package, namely a residual waste cap instead of the landfill cap. A residual waste cap, not in terms of percentages, because percentages may be devious, it's a percentage of what? Some countries are having a wasteful circular economy because they produce 880 kilograms per inhabitant and day, and year municipal solid waste. So residual waste should be, a residual waste cap should be established in kilograms per inhabitant and year, and this would keep in the virtuous actions on waste reduction, reuse, recycling, composting, redesigning of the system, and hopefully we can further minimize incineration and landfilling by means of mixed waste sorting.
Thank you, Enzo. Luca, if you could spend a minute or two telling decision makers at EU level what they need to do now.
They have to do a policy with greater courage on against the climate change. I think. So when we start with zero waste politics, we was alone. But now we are a lot of municipality, a lot of movement, a lot of people who promote it. And I'm an optimist for the future.
Thank you, Luca. So am I. Rebecca, a couple of final words, what you would like to see specifically related to recovering more polyolefins in the legal context today. What can decision makers do now to advance this initiative?
Carry on aligning, so making sure that you have all of the different places. I mean, we've had so many different policies mentioned today. We've had EPR mentioned, Waste Framework Directive. All of these different things need to align together and make sure they don't contradict. And I know a lot of work has been going on in trying to achieve this. It needs to continue. We also need to make sure that we pull in all that commercial, industrial, municipal type waste and make sure that that is legislated for, because we want to capture as much of the material as possible. So don't want it falling out just because it's in a wrong category.
Thank you, Rebecca. And finally, Dominic, a minute to tell us, what do the policymakers that are listening need to do specifically, please? Next steps.
If they were really leading, I agree with Enzo, I would have a residual waste target instead of one on landfill. In order to change the European policy, I would get rid of the R1 criterion in the Waste Framework Directive and the reference to the preference for incineration vis-a-vis other residual waste management methods, because I don't think it's justified anymore. I genuinely don't. I would put incineration into the emissions trading scheme. I think, you know, in the UK, I'm coming from a place that has a landfill tax at almost £100 per tonne. It's about 120 euros per tonne. But incineration isn't taxed at all. And yet you can see this sort of really declining differential between the two on climate terms, and I just don't see the rationale for it. I think going back to some of the things that Luca was saying as well about more difficult to recycle materials, I think the textiles initiative is very welcome, and I think we'll start to see a lot more action on textiles in the near term, because fundamentally our way of dealing with climate change is still too focused on territorial emissions, not sufficiently on consumption, which is what's driving it.
Thank you very much, and a perfect ending to our very interesting panel today. So we're coming to the conclusion of our event. I would like to thank each and every one of our panelists today for their presence, their enthusiasm, their time. Thank you, your insight. I hope that this has contributed to the debate on the need to revise the Waste Framework Directive, but also ETS and the RED Directive, and that the Commission will consider these proposals in their upcoming review of the directive, foreseen for 2023, we hope. So finally, a big thank you to all of you, all our participants on Zoom, YouTube. It was great to have you today with us, and we hope that you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Please remember, Dominic's report will be available soon. Connect with Reloop's LinkedIn, but also Zero Waste Europe. We will keep you, we're working together on this issue, and we will keep you abreast via social media, anything that comes up, and even a potential very big event in the end of 2022 on this issue. So we'll keep you posted. Thank you, everybody, and I'm right on time.
Thanks for
Goodbye.
attending.
Thank you.